Hi class, and welcome to Intro to Psychology, Psych 101. This is going to be our first asynchronous lecture over chapters 1 and 2. So please recognize that this is going to be kind of a general overview of the material and will go along with what you read in your book. And then during our class time, we're going to go into more detail. However, please note that before you actually come to our next asynchronous class, you should have already completed the quiz for chapters 1 and 2. And what we'll do is we'll spend some time going over chapters 1 and 2 in a little bit more detail. The other thing to recognize is that if you have any questions, feel free to stop by office hours, which are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. Also note that I do have these by appointment. If you can't make that time, just go ahead and email me. Additionally, I don't think I mentioned, those will be available on Zoom, so you'll just join via Zoom. One thing to note about how I'm going to be doing this, given the fact that this lecture is going to take me forever if I decide to be perfect about it, I am going to give this in pretty much one take with a couple pauses, so you'll see my screen kind of jump in and out. So I might say something that's a little bit wrong and then go back and correct it immediately. So please do recognize I am trying to do this while still keeping my sanity. So in addition to that, some other things to note about this class is that when you're reading the book, I want you guys to be focused on the big picture and less on the specifics. I'm not going to ask you for dates. I'm not going to ask you for the most minutiae of detail, but I'm going to ask you to apply concepts, to understand these concepts and know what it is we're talking about in a way that isn't just you memorizing this detail. So what I want you guys to think of, especially when we're looking at these first two chapters, right? How is it that psychology evolved into the science that it is today? How do we as psychologists study these individuals that, right, humanity, all of us? And what are some of the issues that psychologists run into while trying to study that? And that's going to be more focused on chapter 2. But before we get into that, let's go over some pretty basic stuff first, which is, what is psychology? So we may have gone over this in class or not, I'm not quite sure, right? Some of this is going to be possibly covered in both the class and the lecture, but what is psychology? Well, psychology is the study of the mind. We are trying to understand who we are as people. This is going to cover a lot of different things, not just what we think, not just what we see, but both internal and external mental processes, observable behaviors, right? What people are actually doing. And note that this is based on objective, verifiable, and scientific evidence. While a lot of psychology in the world is all around us and we see it every day, what we as psychologists try to do is focus on those specific things that we can actually study and put those into some quantifiable way, which is what we'll talk about a lot in chapter 2. So during this class, do recognize that we are going to use this pillar system. So we are going to have a base of our pillar down here as research methods. Research methods is going to be the base of what we do. We are, as psychologists, we are scientists, and good science is built off good research. So all of our pillars that we'll be talking about throughout this class are based off legitimate, good, well-designed scientific research, which is why these first two chapters are the grounding foundation for what we'll be talking about later. Note that just because we're only going over research methods in chapter 2 in name, that doesn't mean that that's all we'll be talking about. We'll be bringing in the ways in which we study people and how we do that throughout the class. But as you guys also know, we will be using these 5 different pillars as our kind of 5 sections. So we will be talking about biological psychology and how that works. We'll be talking about developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, social and personality, as well as mental and physical health. So all of these are included in our definition of what psychology is. And what is some of the interesting stuff about that is that what is psychology? It's the study of the mind, which we know, but the other thing to recognize is it's not all about mental disorders and therapy. It's not focused solely on diagnosing and treating mental problems. Those are important characteristics of what we will be talking about. However, that is not everything. Personally, I am a social psychologist, and what I study are those counterfactual thoughts or if-only thoughts we have after negative events. So if only I wouldn't have pulled out, I wouldn't have gotten into an accident. That's going to be one of those counterfactual thoughts, and maybe we can learn from those. I also want you guys to recognize that it's a very broad field, right? This covers all of human behavior, human thinking, human understanding, It's a lot, and it comes with many subdisciplines, of which we talked about some of them. However, that's not all of them. And so while we now know a little bit about what psychology is, let's talk about where it comes from. And to do so, we're going to go through kind of in order from earliest to most recent, some different, I don't want to say branches, I think a better word might be kind of schools of thought of psychology. So we'll be going through each of these in order, and we're going to start with structuralism and move down the line. But before we even get into that, one thing I want to talk about is the first ever psychology lab, right? So when did this officially become a science? Well, we can talk about how the ancient Greeks and Romans did a lot of philosophy about we as people. But when we come to this as a science, our first actual psychology lab was in 1879. A lot later than people think, right? So this is a very, very young science. One thing about this is that we are making incremental progress, right? We start with the most basic understandings that we can, and we slowly build off of that. Please note that, right, this is going to cover a lot of diverse perspectives. Some of the theories we'll talk about are directly competing with each other, and some have evidence for certain things that work while others can't explain other things. And it's all part of a greater whole of understanding what we are and how we think, how we act, and all that kind of jazz. And so do recognize that over time, we are coming to a lot more clear picture of what it means to be a person, right? It's not that we have little green men in our head who are controlling our every thought, right? We know that not to be true. But over time, we're starting to learn better and better about what it means to be a person, what it means to have our mind functioning either healthily or not, and how that interacts with a lot of other factors, our behaviors, our thoughts, and all that kind of jazz. So as psychologists, we have a lot of different ways to understand this. And one of the best examples I can give of why we're having so much trouble fully recognizing what it means to, right, have our mind and understand is that we as psychologists are trying to study something that we can't see, we can't really interact with, right? I can't open you up and figure out what's going on in there. And the ways we do this maybe aren't as clear as some other sciences. So one of the best examples or metaphors I've seen is regarding a bunch of blinded individuals who are asked to describe an elephant. So if you look at this picture here, what we see is that all of these individuals are describing pieces of what we see and is what is part of our lives of psychology, right? So over here we have somebody pointing to a pointy piece, which must be a spear, a long rope tail, right? This is a big trunk of a tree. This could be a snake. None of them are right, but they're all describing parts of a whole, which maybe aren't all right. Maybe it's not encompassing everything we need it to. So as we continue to learn about this science, we are gaining more and more information and starting to piece together the bigger picture of what that elephant actually is. But that is kind of more of today in the modern day, but let's talk about what that looked like back in the day. So we talked briefly about structuralism as kind of our first foray into the science of psychology. So structuralism was the idea that we wanted to break down consciousness into basic elements of sensation, so what we're seeing, and feelings, and what we are mentally feeling. So this was with Wilhelm Wundt, who is the original founder of the first psychology lab, and he developed what we now refer to as introspection, or looking inward. And this is a word that's thrown around a lot now, and oftentimes, right, if you do any meditation or anything of that, you might think about how you introspect or take time to reflect on who you are, what you're doing. We call this looking inward, right? So taking a moment to look inside and see kind of how we are, maybe how we're feeling, what we're thinking about. All of those are things that we don't often do, and we'll talk about why this is so important here on the next slide as well. But what Wundt was trying to do was examine and measure our thoughts and our mental activities. We didn't have any way to, right, understand what people's thoughts were, so the first way we tried to do this is to ask people, What are you thinking about? Right? So if we can start by asking, what are the things that you're thinking about? How are you feeling right now? And then Titchener, a colleague of Wundt, then also wanted to add physical sensations. So what is it that you're feeling when I right, have you hold something or kind of see something or hear something? What is going on in your head when that's happening? Because we know, right, if you put your hand on a hot stove, say, you're going to quickly take it away because that physical sensation is painful. But what's happening up here to make us do that? And this is kind of where we're starting, right, at the very basics of, so what's going on here? I know I have thoughts. I know other people probably have thoughts, and I know that these things happen, but how? How do they happen? And so structuralism was really interested in this idea of introspection and describing these conscious experience, the aspects of a conscious experience. And how we did that was what you would do is you would ask individuals questions about sensation, right? So, and questions about feelings. So we might ask people questions about the quality of the sensations that they're feeling, the intensity of these, how clear is it? Right? And these can be right, things regarding thoughts. These can be things regarding what you see. And then we can talk about feelings, how things are making individuals feel. And this was done on a kind of two-sided scale. So is this giving you pleasure or displeasure when you think or see or hold this? Is this making you relaxed or very tense? And is this making you very excited or depressed? Now, these aren't exactly, right, all that we were doing, but this is a good overview of some of the stuff. And we can also think about why this might be good or bad to do. And what I mean about that is, while it is a good way to start looking at this, it doesn't have, right, it doesn't come without any flaws. So some of the pros of this is, right, it does allow us to introspect and look inward to examine our thoughts and mental activities. And it starts to move us towards an objective way. And by that, we're talking about a way that we can measure and test these thoughts, not just kind of guessing. And when we talk about Sigmund Freud, we'll get into that a bit. But there's also some cons to this, right? This is very subjective. So I might be thinking about my family, and I might think very positively, right, on that kind of pleasure, displeasure. However, you might have experiences with your family that are not as positive and might, right, feel very displeasurable and very tense when you think about your family. And the other thing is, it's really hard to train individuals to do this well. We're going to spend some time in class talking about this, but how do you get somebody to actually, right, do this well? If I'm asking you to think about what you're thinking about and describe it, how is that working for you? So that is kind of the basics of structuralism, trying to understand the structure of the brain, trying to understand how these parts are working and what they're doing. Afterwards, we moved on to functionalism. And functionalism is this idea of how we're starting to look at how consciousness helps people adapt to their environments. So while structuralism was focused on, right, the general gist of the brain, what is going on, what it's doing, the structure of the brain, functionalism is looking more at how these mental processes guide our abilities to make decisions, how we adapt to our environments, how we, maybe you might say, function in an everyday environment, right? So not necessarily, okay, so we think thoughts, that's cool, structuralists, we get that, but how do we make our way in the world, right? How do we adapt to our environment? How do I learn how to grow up and be a person and do all of these things? And so again, you can see this isn't very far in. We're only in these 1890s, but we're already starting to see some people going outside of what the norm of the research is to try to better understand it. So now maybe we have another scientist going from the trunk of the elephant and trying to understand it that way. Now maybe we have somebody looking at the ears of the elephant. So another way in which we can describe psychology. And so with functionalism, a brief history of this involves William James. You might know William James from what we'll talk about later, the James Lange theory of emotion, and this is going to be one of the ways in which we understand how our emotions work. So James and Lange, I should say, thought that emotions were adaptive to our situation, right? So why do we have things like fear? Well, fear helps us if we're in a scary situation that we need to escape from. It's useful, it's functional for a bear, for us to be afraid of a bear if we see one, because that's going to help us escape that. So really with functionalism, how are different concepts adaptive, right? How do they function in a society? And what's interesting about this is that this was actually influenced a bit by Darwin and natural selection, right? How is it that our brains have been naturally selected to work well in the world? And this goes into many, many things we'll continue to talk about throughout the semester. How is it that, right, us evolving to be social creatures and exist in a society helps or hurts us? How is it that we have adapted to do these things? And generally, William James believed that all of our abilities must have evolved due to adaptation, right? These both physical traits and behaviors. Now, this isn't a major perspective much anymore, but parts of it can be found in evolutionary psychology, in understanding how we have evolved and how our brain has evolved. So the one important thing to know is that structuralism and functionalism are two of our first kind of forays into the psychology, the science of psychology, I should say. And what are the differences between them? Well, structuralism, again, is looking at breaking down these thoughts and mental activities, looking at their structure, while functionalism is looking at how our thoughts and mental activities actually help us function in our lives. So I like this because I think it's a very clear way to help describe the difference between one and the other. So moving on, one of the next big perspectives in psychology that we talk about is what we call Gestalt. And Gestalt is a German word that translates mostly into the, well, I'll get to that in a second, but Gestalt is the idea that we shouldn't be breaking down our consciousness into these, what we call discrete or like separate components, right? What we should do is kind of understand something in regards to how it works as a whole. And so this is the idea that the whole of consciousness is actually greater than just the sum of its parts. Just by describing these individual pieces, we're not getting at everything entirely. Similar again to that elephant metaphor that I talked about earlier. So you can think about how these psychologists in the Gestalt perspective are really going to be opposite of structuralists, right? We don't want to focus on those discrete measures. They're a lot more like these functionalists. And one of the cool ways in which Gestalt started to look at how this works is what they wanted to understand was how is it that the mind works when we can see it more or less break down? Not in a mental health way, but when we see things like perceptual illusions. So a picture like this where if you stare at it, it starts to look like it moves. So how is it that something like that happens when we can discretely or, separately describe what happens in the eye, but how is it that interacts with what we know to make some changes? So with Gestalt, again, we are talking about the sum is greater than the whole of the parts, or that consciousness can't just be described by each individual piece. There's so much of it that all interacts with one another that we can't really get to it that closely. So that was the Gestalt perspective, and then we move on to what a lot of people are very familiar with. Oh, there goes my cat, which is psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is going to be at the turn of the century from the 1900s, and this is going to be somebody many of you probably recognize, started by a medical doctor in Vienna who was a neurologist. He had a series of patients with nervous disorders, or we should call those, right, nervous system disorders without any physical causes. So he believed that this must be caused by the mind. So what this neurologist, who hopefully you know is Sigmund Freud, was interested in was it must be some kind of unconscious mind that's doing this. And what he believed was that there is a constant unconscious conflict within a person that determines how they act, how they feel, and all of these things. And that he believed that we would call these conflicts here, and how this was going against one another, is primarily based on this desire to satisfy these personal desires and the need to live by society's rules. So Freud was really into this concept that people have to repress certain urges, right? There is a time to, right, go to the bathroom. It's not just go whenever you want. There's a time to, right, stand up and get a drink of water if you're in, right, like a middle school or high school class. But we have these conflicts, and a lot of those can be thought about in regards to this idea of, right, psychoanalysis, and so understanding, analyzing, right, our psyche, our mind. So we call this insight therapy, and it was originally for things like fear and anxiety. And what Freud was really interested in, which is, as we'll talk about later as well, something that is completely what we call unfalsifiable. There's no way to prove if this is true or not, right? We don't have any way to tell if Freud's theories actually are true or not. And we'll talk about some of them later. One of them you might have heard, probably the most shocking, is the idea of the Oedipus complex, or the idea that maybe men have an unconscious desire right here, this personal desire to kill their father and sleep with their mother. And right, maybe that is causing unconscious conflicts with your father and with your mother and with the rest of your significant other. And so we'll talk about why that's kind of crazy. Also, Freud was a huge proponent of using cocaine, which was legal back in the time. So that guy was literally on stuff. But he was interested in how early childhood might affect development, right? What is it that's going on when we're kids that might affect how we grow up, right? What if it's the case where your parents are very, very strict with you? Might that change how you are as an adult? Freud also thought about this in very psychosexual terms regarding different stages, which we will again get into later when we talk more about Freud. This is kind of the first lead into our ideas of repression or repressed memories, where Freud thought that, and it is true that people can repress memories, but Freud was very interested in the idea that people will hide or kind of block out or repress any mentally negative, like super negative things, right? Maybe a car accident or a sexual assault, or these things individuals might actually repress. But they don't go away, and they might lead to unconscious motivations. And so the biggest thing with all of this, again, as I said, is it's completely untestable. And we really have no way to show if it does truly exist or not, if these theories are legitimate or not. The other thing that Freud did is the idea of dreams. He believed these were what we call the royal road to the unconscious, or the idea that while we're sleeping, our unconscious mind is taking over. It's focusing on what's going on, and it's allowing us to, right, when we wake up and remember our dreams, maybe it's allowing us to understand what our unconscious is saying. This is, again, an untestable and unfounded theory, but it holds a lot of weight for people who aren't in psychology today. So with psychoanalysis, this was more or less one of our first insights into a psychological therapy, right? And this is a therapy focusing on bringing those unconscious thoughts into conscious awareness. And some of you might know what this picture is, what these are called. These are called Rorschach inkblot tests. And what these are kind of tools in which psychoanalysts, right, Freud and his cadre of colleagues would look at, or give to individuals to look at, and these individuals would sit there and they would study their picture and they would twist it and turn it, and what they would be asked is, what do you see? And right, what you come up with probably has some bearing on what is going on, right, in your unconscious mind. So if you, right, this isn't a good example of this, but if you see something like, right, I see two people fighting, maybe Freud would say, it sounds like your unconscious is really hung up on, right, your parents who were arguing when you were young, which he may or may not know to be true. And so these are ways that Freud was trying to bring these deeper levels of thought that maybe we're not totally aware of to the surface. It's definitely a very interesting concept. It has some applicability, but it's something we can't say for sure means anything. It's some other things that we had here were things like hypnosis and free association. Free association is going to be the idea of kind of saying the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear something. So if I say the word card, you might think credit, right? Credit card. You might think birthday card. And whatever you're saying there might give me as a therapist or some kind of researcher insight into that unconscious level of your mind. It's all a bunch of hogwash, to be quite honest with you, right? There's no way that we can test it. It sounds really neat, but it again is completely untestable, and it's more or less fallen by the wayside. However, it has stuck around in popular culture for very long. So after the psychoanalytic schools of thought, we moved into behaviorism. And so this behaviorism lasted right from 1910 to probably almost the 1970s, quite honestly. And behaviorism is exactly what you would think it is. This was mostly done by a guy named John Watson, or the dude with the biggest forehead in psychology, B.F. Skinner. You could literally land a plane on that thing. And what they were interested in understanding was overt behavior, not covert or hidden behavior, but overt. What is it that people are doing? I can't read your mind. I can't understand your thoughts. It's hard to do that. If I rely on self-reports, you might be lying to me. Memories aren't always accurate, right? These are all unreliable methods. But what I can tell for sure is, right, if you decide to pick a pink pen or a blue pen, I guess pencils here, but those I can actually measure which one, right, if I have them on the table, which one you choose to use. And so what these individuals thought was that behavior is primarily the result of learning. And what we mean by that is over time we see patterns in the world. And as we'll talk about when we describe and really go into depth on the types of learning, what we do is we find patterns and we follow them. So when your mom tells you to go to bed and you do, you find out that, you're not going to get, right, any negative punishment. But if you get lippy to your mom or, right, you decide not to go to bed, you might be punished. And that helps you learn what behaviors you need to do. A lot of this relies on the idea that, right, our mental processes are a black box. We don't know what's going on inside. So we want to use some kind of understanding of these patterns, rewards, and punishments, and understanding how we act. The cool thing about behaviorism is we've now moved into a time in psychology where we didn't care about thoughts, right? We avoided thinking here. Now, this was a dominant perspective. So there were still individuals studying how people think and do stuff like that, but we were mostly focused on the idea of how we learn and grow and change our behaviors based on other things. Some experiments you might know, and we'll talk about these more in class, are Skinner's pigeons experiments, where he taught pigeons how to turn and do different things. You may have heard of Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, in which they were looking at how kids learn from parents or learn from adults. One of the interesting things, and one of my favorite quotes from B.F. Skinner, is the idea that he said, right, he believed that if you give me a child, I can go ahead and shape them into any job that I want them to. I can make them a doctor, I can make them a lawyer, I can make them a thief, I can make them a merchant, I can make them anything I want, because I can create a pattern of rewards and punishments to influence what they will do. So this almost sounds a little, I've been asked, is this brainwashing? And I wouldn't say it's brainwashing, but I would say, right, we all are in these patterns of learning, and depending on how we influence others, right, how I might teach my kid based on those patterns is going to influence how they'll behave down the line, right? If I don't punish my kid for peeing their pants, why would they learn to not pee their pants? So this is still a major force in the field. You still see it in things like cognitive psychology and learning, in behavioral therapy. However, you got to remember that we also are now integrating other portions of this. Some other approaches, and probably the one I think that's kind of become a very common approach, is this idea of the cognitive approach. The idea that the brain is almost like a computer, right? That the thoughts and mental processes that are going on behind the scenes, right? Your kind of task manager that's keeping you breathing, keeping you thinking, keeping, right, you blinking. Those are important in understanding how we're living, but it's not, right? It's not just the idea that behaviorism in our behaviors are the only thing we're doing. Some other fields we see are things like cognitive neuroscience and biopsychology. So these are much more modern, right? Now that we are able to actually study and get different things, right, oftentimes looked at in rats or other animals, right? Not going to go ahead and open your head up and teach you how to, not teach you, but I should say, and cut out a piece of your brain and see what it does. But what these are doing are linking mental processes to activities in the nervous system. So parts of the brain and other bodily processes. So really kind of integrating how our brain is working and causing different, right, behaviors or mental thoughts and processes. And this has gotten really advanced, right? So understanding how chronic stress can affect you as a human being. Things like that are kind of the more advanced side of cognitive neuroscience and biopsychology. As mentioned briefly before, we can also talk about things like an evolutionary approach, and this is going to focus on how all of, right, our behaviors and mental processes are part of an adaptive system which has allowed us to survive and become, right, the society we are today. We see this a lot kind of woven in and out. There are evolutionary psychologists out there that are really interested in this. And now we even see what I think is very cool is this idea of a cultural approach to psychology and focused on how cultures reflect and shape the psychological processes of their members, right? How is it that growing up in a culture in the United States is different than growing up to somewhere in Europe? And how we still think mostly the same, but we do see differences between people and cultures. For instance, one of the most interesting things in the last 20 years regarding ADHD is that there are very low rates of ADHD in France, not due to how they diagnose it, but there are very low rates of ADHD compared to the United States. And what is it maybe about the French culture that is lowering the rates of ADHD? Okay. So there's a lot going on in kind of the history and the understanding of where we came from as a field. But beyond that, we also have to talk about how we actually study psychology, not just these kind of general ideas. But what we're going to do is we're going to first talk about, the basics, right? How we study this. Then we're going to talk about two different kinds of research that we do in psychology. So descriptive and then experimental research. And when you think back to the goals of psychology, right, why do we do this? Well, to describe what's going on, to make accurate predictions for what people should do in most situations. We also want to demonstrate some control over some variables. We want to set up experiments so that we know exactly what it is that's causing this, right? If you get no sleep the night before an exam and you didn't study, we're not exactly sure maybe why you didn't do well on an exam, assuming you don't do well on it. But, right, it could, I should say before I go into the but, it could be the idea that you didn't get any sleep. It could be the idea you didn't study. It's probably a mix of both, but we can't say that it's really one or the other. So a psychologist, what they might do is they might run an experiment where they have some people be sleep deprived before an exam and some people just not study. And then we see how people do regarding those exams, right? And that would help us understand some control over some of the variables, and we'd be able to better say, well, actually, right, both of these don't help you do good on an exam, but it seems like being sleep deprived actually makes you worse, or not studying makes you perform worse. And that helps us to explain with confidence our findings and our understanding. So when we think about this, we go back to everybody's favorite, the scientific method. So, right, how does the scientific method work? Well, pretty easy. So we have questions. So maybe my question is, what hurts more? So does it hurt more? Is it going to hurt more if I hit you with a hammer in the hand, or if I hit you with a feather in the hand? So I have a question, right? What's going to hurt more if I hit you with a feather or with a hammer? I was trying to think of some way to say, is it going to hurt more if you break up? But I can't really find any physical things to make that a little clearer. But what happens with these questions is, well, we develop what we call a hypothesis, right? And so our hypothesis, or our educated guess, or a specific statement about what we think should occur, is an educated guess, kind of more or less saying, this is what I think is going to happen. Now, with something like a hammer versus my feather over here, this isn't going to be too difficult to understand. But we can ask you the question, right? What is going to hurt worse? Breaking up with a significant other that you've been in a relationship with for a year, or finding out that a loved one has passed? Those are pain, right? Those are pain we might feel, but we don't really know. So maybe we look at research that has also been done or understand that. But these will help us to form a hypothesis in which we will go ahead and test. So maybe I bring people in, smack them in the hand with a hammer versus a feather, and then I ask them questions, right? So how bad did that hurt on a scale from 1 to 10? So this should be able to generate and refine our theories about psychology. And what theories are hypothetical accounts of how and why a phenomenon happens. So this isn't just saying that, hey, right, hammers hurt more than feathers. This is saying that hammers hurt more than feathers because, right, we are crushing nerves here, which are running signals up to our brain. And maybe we're starting to bring in things like biopsychology and neuropsychology to understand why these phenomena do occur. And once we get that down, we say, what about other types of pain? So in one of the research labs I worked in, we used to put people's hands into cold water. And I had to do this as a test. And I'll tell you what, the water was 34 degrees, and you don't think it's that bad until about 10 seconds in, where all of a sudden your hand just shoots hot pain. And then all of a sudden you go, oh. And that's a very different pain than some of the other things I did, in which we were asked to be poked on our fingers. Kind of poked on our fingers with very sharp needle, or not, I don't want to say sharp, but pressed needles on our fingers, which also hurt, but was a different type of hurt. And now we're starting to understand how maybe pain works in the body, right? So these are going to be a good way to understand our kind of scientific method. So the scientific method, though, is going to rely on two specific things that we need to talk about. And again, I recognize that this may or may not be some kind of 6th grade stuff that we went over, but let's just get us all on the same page. So the scientific method relies on two things. It relies on variables, which we would consider the whats. So variables are factors or characteristics that are manipulated or measured in research. So these are things like, right, using a hammer versus a feather. But there are also things like a scale, right? How we measure that pain. Do we measure that pain on a scale from 1 to 10? Do we measure that pain on a scale from 1 to 100, right? Do we measure that pain by using numbers? Do we measure that pain using, right, a picture of people smiling or feeling or looking like they're in pain? But beyond that, we also can talk about the operational definition. And this is the how. So the operational definition is a description of the exact methods that we will use to measure a variable. And how we do this in psychology are, right, common measures that we use here are self-reports. We might use behavioral measures, so how people behave, right? Which color pencil do they choose here? Or physiological measures. We can hook people up to different kind of programmed software where we can see how much skin, It's called galvanic skin response, how much sweat they're producing in their skin, how fast their breathing is, how fast their heart rate is, where their eyes are looking at on a screen. And all of these things can be used in multiple ways to help us better understand. So let's do a little bit more of a deep dive into what variables are. So variables are, again, what we are measuring. And there are two types of variables. It's very important to get this. This is something that seems really easy, but I've even seen graduate students mess them up every once in a while. So we have two types of variable: an independent variable, and this is going to be our variable that's manipulated by the experimenter. So in our example with pain, we might manipulate whether somebody is hit with a hammer or a feather. And what we do is we expect that to cause a change in our other variable, our dependent variable, right? So it might be the idea that when we ask people for our scale, our pain rating scale, right? How much pain are you in? Right? That is going to be our dependent measure, and that's expected to change as a result of what type of independent variable or level of the independent variable that we might have, right? So this depends on the independent variable. We might expect the hammer to be a lot more painful than the feather. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you know that. But independent variables specifically have what we call different levels. So in the example we just talked about, we have the level of a hammer versus a feather. We can also talk about many different other levels. So things like depression. I've seen these scales use depression as low depressive symptoms, medium depressive symptoms, high or clinically what we would call depressed depressive symptoms, right? So they don't have to just be right one or the other, but they can be part of a longer or a bigger thing, right? We can talk about independent variables having different levels based on height. So maybe we look at people who are over 6 feet or under 6 feet, things like this. But for a house plant, right, maybe we want to do an experiment. I had to do a couple science fairs in middle school, and I think it was middle school, but the idea is that maybe a really easy project is how much water do you need, or what are the best conditions in which you can grow a house plant? And so maybe we use two different independent variables. Our first one being, right, how much we water the plant. So maybe in one level we water our plant daily, and the other time we water, or in another plant we water it weekly. So now we have two levels of our independent variable here. We might have a different independent variable. You can absolutely have more than one independent variable, right? And so say we give it three, we have three different versions for this one. So we have, in terms of how much sun we give the plant, we either give it no sunlight, occasional sunlight during the day, so maybe we put it in a place that doesn't get much sun during the day, but some, maybe 2 hours of sun, and then continuous sunlight during the day, or sunlight that is actually going to be pretty much constant throughout the day. So what we might do is we might take 6 different plants and put them in one of each of these cells. So when we plot it, it might look something like this, right? Where we actually, what we do is we have 6 different plants, 3 of which are watered daily, right? And one of which is watered without any sun, right down here. One of them is watered with some sun, and one of them is watered with lots of sun. And then we also see what happens when we water these weekly. Oh, I got a puppy. So what you see here is we have our 6 different independent variable levels, right? Where we take our 2 here and 3 here, and we see them, all 6 of them over here. Oop, my mouse wasn't working, sorry. But what you'll notice is we only have one level of our independent variable, and our independent variable is just growth in inches. And for this example, just imagine that I'm only looking at daily watering and not weekly watering. But the idea here is that helps us show our dependent variable based on how many inches our plant grew. And then we have our 3 independent variable levels here, not counting the water variables. So what you can see here is this is some pretty basic science, hopefully, and this is the basics for how psychology works. So maybe in one condition, right, I have people who give or take a weekly versus daily, let's say meditative, do a meditative app, either weekly or daily. And then my other independent variable is how long they have to do it for. Maybe the first one is 1 minute. Maybe the second one is 5 minutes, and the third one is 10 minutes, and how long they have to meditate for. And then maybe what I look at is how happy they are after, right, a couple weeks. And, right, we're not going to measure that in inches, but we'll measure that in happiness, which might be a self-reported measure, which we'll talk about. But that's kind of the idea behind independent and dependent variables. Now, with operational definitions are a little bit tougher, right? Because when we think about how we measure something in psychology, it's different than how we measure things other places. If we want to measure how long something is, we use a ruler. Maybe it's in inches, maybe it's in feet, maybe it's in metric units, so meters. Almost forgot that. But when we ask people, how happy are you? How do we get at that? Right? What does it mean to be happy? Right? So what happens is we have to be very specific. We have to in our measurements, in our understandings of our measurements. So we need to identify specific and observable events or conditions in a way that other people could follow along and do this study with them, with other researchers and other participants. So you might consider this a clear, concise, and objective definition of a measure. So again, that's not that hard if we think about things like temperature, if we think about things like how fast your heart is going. But how might you measure something like kindness? How might you measure something like aggression or honesty? Well, there's a lot of different ways, right? So maybe with kindness, you see how likely people are to help someone pick up dropped books. Maybe you have a person walk by, right? They're walking by with some books, they drop some books, and you see if that person helps or not. That's one way we can measure kindness. It's maybe not the best, but it is one way. This idea of aggression is an example I've seen used many times in research. And what you do is you have people have headphones on, right? So they put on headphones, and if they lose a round, another person playing a game with them can basically crank the volume of some static noise that this person has to listen to for a couple seconds. And so if you're going to be aggressive, you're probably going to crank the volume and make the other person listen to this really loud, obnoxious noise. Things like honesty, though, honesty is kind of tough to measure because we all lie, right? We all lie at some point in our lives, but one way that we can measure honesty is see if children, when observed through a one-way mirror or by a camera, follow the rule if we put something on the table that says take one only when they're trick-or-treating. So the idea behind this is a variable is what is being measured, whereas an operational definition is how we are defining what is being measured. So again, these would all be, right, independent or dependent variables, depending, right? This is probably a good dependent variable right here. This aggression is so how loud did they decide to make the volume for each trial? And that's going to be really helpful to understand, right, how we're defining what is being measured. So that's the basics. Great. So those are kind of the basics that we need to understand. And now let's talk about them in terms of how we understand and do research in psychology. So the first way we do research in psychology is what we call descriptive research. And so the goal of this is to describe and predict behavior and mental processes. Descriptive research, we describe things. So these are going to be in a couple different, there's going to be a couple different ways we can do descriptive research. And really the goal of this is just to understand what people do before we even try to look at why they do it. So we might use naturalistic observations. So we might naturally observe how people do things. We might use what we call case studies when maybe there's an issue due to how would I say this? Maybe this is a population we can't get a lot of access to, right? If you wanted to look at something like orphans and how they handle being orphans, one thing you might do is look for people who are orphans. You probably don't want to go kill somebody's parents to make them orphans to do this. We can also do probably what I consider the bread and butter of psychology research, surveys, right? This is just where we go ahead and ask people questions, right? How happy are you? How this, how that? And then correlational, we'll talk about kind of relating two variables to one another. So starting with naturalistic observation, right? These are just observations which occur in an environment that typically we would see these observations. So what happens here is, right, you might want to look at how many people engage in social distancing on a sidewalk where maybe there's not 6 feet of width on the sidewalk. So what you can do is you can kind of sit over to the side and you can watch these people walk by one another, and you can see if they, right, veer off to the side to try to maintain social distance. Maybe they just keep going or put on a mask, and you can see how this happens. And one thing you can think about is, do you want to participate in these, or do you want to just observe this? So one great example of this is a very famous psychologist, Leon Festinger. He once joined a cult. He joined a cult that said that the world was going to end in like 1953 on like July 15th. I don't remember the exact day, but what he did was he infiltrated. He joined the cult, and then he just kind of hung out and he pretended he was in it, and he just took a lot of notes about what was going on. And what he was interested in was what's going to happen when the world doesn't end, right? Assuming the world doesn't end, which it didn't. And he wanted to see how people rationalize or understand their beliefs after, right, they believed this happened, it was going to happen, and it doesn't. And so naturalistic observation is interesting because that's kind of a private setting, this cult. I don't think they would have let him join if he was saying, yeah, I want to see what happens when this doesn't happen, right? When this spaceship doesn't come to take us away, which is what they believed. So some strengths of this are that it's a realistic setting. We can go outside and see what's going on. We can join cults or different clubs and maybe see what's going on within them. But there's some limits to this, right? This can only describe things. We can't understand why. I put no private or rare events here. You can, but maybe that's an ethical thing, right? You probably shouldn't, right, sneak into somebody's wedding. You shouldn't crash a wedding to, right, see how weddings go. People might be aware of you watching them, right? So there might be things like self-awareness. You're focused on this, and we can call these demand characteristics, where if you see somebody watching you, you might be more likely to behave in a certain way. Think about how you might drive if you see a police officer up ahead. You might all of a sudden change the way you drive based on somebody else being there. Not only that, but maybe what the observer is paying attention to is not exactly true, right? So the idea here being that maybe I really, really, really want to see how people freak out about this cult, and maybe I'm not paying attention to the people who are acting normal after this cult doesn't end up being taken by aliens. The other one is regarding poor control, right? So we can't exactly control all the conditions, so we don't know the causes and effects of what's happening. There might be other things outside of our control. When we do stuff in a lab, we've got a lot more control over the setting. Not all control, but a lot more. So that is the descriptive research, more focused on observation, but we can also talk about case studies. And case studies are interesting because these allow us to get an intensive examination of a specific person or a specific situation or a rare group or a rare population of people. Many of you may have heard of this guy down here. His name was Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker back in the 1800s who had a metal spike go through his skull, and he survived, and I believe he kept both his eyes even. And what they did with Phineas Gage was they looked at how his personality changed after this. He used to be a very kind man. He was a family man. He loved his family. But afterwards, he didn't. He was very lewd and crude. He would go out drinking. He was a lot less kind of a person. So the strengths of this are going to be that, right, we get very detailed and sometimes rare or private phenomena that we can't make in other places. I can't stick a rod through your head and see how that changes you. Some limits, though, is that it may not be representative, right? So if you were to, right, if an alien came down on Earth and took you up and tried to do a case study on you, and they tried to get all the information they wanted, they might believe that all humans are, right, however old you are whatever gender you are Stetson students, right, and have these very specific qualities to you that don't generalize to everyone. So it's important to recognize that, right, case studies aren't perfect, but they also give us some really deep dives into what people are doing in these rare or private situations, and especially ones that aren't anything that we can recreate legally or ethically. Well, beyond that, we have the more basic one, which is survey research, right? And surveys are more or less just questionnaires or interviews that we give to people. Some of you may recognize the name Kinsey. I forget his first name, Alfred Kinsey, whatever it might be. Kinsey was a guy who was very interested in the 1950s in understanding sexual habits of United States citizens. At the time, this was incredibly taboo to talk about, right? People did not talk about sex. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but think about the strengths of this data, right? We can get lots of data, it can be fast, and it can be inexpensive to collect, right? I just ask you all of these questions. But there's some other problems here. You might run into things like question wording. So, right, do you think that all Stetson students are stupid? Is a way that you can word a question, but you can also word that question another way, right? What percentage of Stetson students do you think have below average IQ, right? And those are very different and tell you a lot about this. You can also think about, right, this question, have you ever been sad, yes or no? That's a question. It's probably not a good question, right? Maybe we might ask something like, how often do you feel down or blue in a given week? That's going to maybe give us a little bit different information. Now, back to Kinsey in regarding this idea of response bias and social desirability bias. Well, Kinsey found a lot of really interesting data in his research. He found that during his face-to-face interviews that he used, in which, let's be honest, people are probably not going to be as honest as expected, right? Imagine that you're in an interview and this guy asks you, well, how's your sex life? And this is the 1950s, and, right, like most people, you were like, I am not comfortable answering that question, right? So you might lie, you might say something that's not true. If you are somebody who's been unfaithful to your partner, you might not want to tell somebody that. So you might not be telling the truth. You might, what we do is what we would call following the social desirability bias. So this idea that you want to go with something that makes you look like a socially desirable person, right? You don't want to sound like the bad guy here. And also we can run into things like sampling errors. So maybe we take a sample that isn't representative of everyone. Maybe it's biased. If I only looked at Stetson students and I asked you, what is the best university in the country? I'm probably going to get a little bit biased responses, right? And also, I'm getting a convenience sample. And what we mean by that is it's not everybody. It's just a group that was convenient and easy to get a hold of. And with Kinsey's study, he found that 50% of men cheated, 26% of women cheated, and that 10% of the population engaged in homosexual activities. Whoa. That's crazy, right? That's absurd. We know that's not true, right? It's not that half of all men cheat and a quarter of all women cheat. What he did was he took the responses only from people in jails, which are a very different type of person than maybe the general population. I'm sure there are very normal people in jail, but there's also people who maybe aren't exactly right, the average person. So when we get this data, we have to be very sure, right? Think back to when we talked about case studies. We got to be very sure that we are getting accurate and representative samples and making sure that we are finding a random group of people who there's enough people and are diverse enough that they kind of give us the general trends. So that's survey research. Now, these are all really interesting ways that we can look at things, but then we run into what we call correlational research. So this is research on how one variable might be related to another and how strong those relationships are. So this is really useful in times that we can't exactly get information very easily, or we don't actually have the ability to, how would I say this, more or less like change these variables. So for instance, if I want to, right, going back to Kinsey's example, if I want to see what percentage of the population engages in extramarital affairs or cheating, what I can't do is I can't, say I want to say, let me rephrase. So I want to do that and I want to see which gender, male or female, cheats more often. Well, you can't force people to be one gender or the other, right? I can't say, okay, so you're going to be a boy and you're going to be a girl and you're going to be a boy and you're going to be a girl. I can't do that. And I also probably shouldn't say, like, hey, go to this situation and, right, decide if you want to cheat on your spouse or not. That's probably not going to fly. So what we can do with this is we can use data that we already have, and we can try to analyze trends or predictions. And how this works is we use 3 different types of correlations, or basically how we understand correlations is the idea that correlations can be positive, whereas one variable increases, another variable also increases, right? So down here we have this idea that as exposure to violent TV goes up, it might be the case where acts of aggression also go up. Now, there's a lot of debate in the field on whether violent TV and violent video games cause acts of aggression to go up. This is just an example. We have also a negative correlation. And so the idea is that increasing the value of one of these decreases the other value, right? So maybe we look at how optimistic you are and how ill you are. So if you are very, very, very ill, say you have, right, stage 4 cancer or something, you're probably not very optimistic about your health. But as your illness goes down, right, say now we're talking about somebody here at the bottom who has the flu, they're probably more optimistic, right? So the idea behind that is going to be, right, as one of these variables goes up, the other goes down, where in our first one, as one of these variables goes up, the other goes up, or as one of those variables goes down, the other one goes down, right? So you can imagine a positive correlation, another positive correlation might be the idea of, what's a good negative correlation? Excuse me, I mean positive correlation the other direction. So we can think about maybe different types of animals as gray matter size decreases in the brain, right, for different animals, intelligence decreases, right? So a mouse is going to be less intelligent than a human being. But we can also think about that the reverse, right? As brain, or as gray matter in the brain increases, intelligence increases. The last one we'll talk about also is zero correlations, or no predictive value. So this is the idea that, right, these two variables don't have anything to do with one another. So, right, it might be the case where there's no more or less crimes depending on the phases of the moon, right? It's not the case where there's a full moon and there are more crimes. These are about, right, it's about the same amount of crimes for all phases of the moon. So when we look at correlations in descriptive research, we often run into what we call a correlation coefficient, or an R value. So a correlation coefficient often goes with this R. And you can think about this R as relatedness, right? So how related are these two concepts? So how related are shoe size and reading ability? Well, R equals a positive or negative value, right? So as we said over here, this can be, right, a positive where one increases and the other increases, or one decreases and the other decreases. It can also technically be 0 over here, but we can see this is a positive correlation because it's got the plus. And what's interesting about correlations is they go between -1 and 1. So it's just a scale from -1 to 0 to 1. And what it is a indicator of the strength of that relationship. So the closer you get to either 1 or -1, the stronger it is. The important thing to know is that the positive and negative actually only means direction. It doesn't mean right. A negative correlation of a negative 0.37 correlation is as strong as a positive 0.37 correlation. It's basically just mirrored image on each side, and it's telling you which direction it's going. Is it going one goes up and the other goes up, positive, or one goes down and the other goes down? Or excuse me, one goes down and the other goes up, negative. So these descriptive research with correlations, right? Some strengths of this are that we can test predictions, evaluate theories, and suggest new hypotheses that maybe we can't actually do when we manipulate the variables. So we can't always manipulate variables. I can't force you to be one gender or the other, right? We can't manipulate how old you are, how young you are, how tall you are. But the important thing, and that you may have heard before, is the idea that correlation is not causation. And what do we mean by that? Well, the idea is that we can never definitively assume causation from a correlational relationship. For instance, we might run into what we call reverse causation. So we might believe that married people are more likely to be happy. So if you are married, your happiness goes up. Well, is that the only way we can think about it? Well, how do you think unhappy people are, right? So if I just get married, all of a sudden, am I happy? So what about the other version, right? Maybe happy people tend to be more likely to get married. Miserable people aren't trying to, right, find a significant other, or are, dealing with their own, right, feelings of unhappiness before they try to find a partner. So the idea is that maybe it's not just the one-way relationship, right? And another one we can talk about is reciprocal causation. So think about it this way. If helping people increases your happiness, right? So you give somebody $5 and you see how happy it makes them, that makes you happy, right? Well, if you're happy, maybe you're more likely to help other people. And then you can see this kind of reciprocal cycle. So, right, is it the case that if you're happy, you help people, and helping people makes you more happy, and then it just kind of keeps growing on itself? However, not only can we say that there's other kind of issues with correlations regarding that, regarding this reciprocal and reverse causation, but there might be correlations that are just random. Like what you see here is a very interesting correlation. Now notice, right, this is an R of positive 0.791. It's a very, very strong correlation. And what it's looking at is as the amount of chocolate, the amount of the population of a country eats more chocolate, the amount of Nobel laureates, right, or Nobel Prize winners goes up. Right? So if you believe that correlation equals causation, how would you want to win more Nobel Prizes if you wanted your country to win more Nobel Prizes? You would force everybody to eat more chocolate if you thought that would work. And let's be honest, that doesn't seem like it's really going to work here. That's just kind of the way it is. So with that, we can really talk about some spurious correlations, which we'll discuss more in class as well. Thanks, Kat. I don't know if you guys heard that or not, but she wanted to be very loud. Apologies, my cat has decided to join me. Which reminds me, if you're listening to this and paying attention, please, in the ungraded question where I ask you if you have any questions, please write down that my cat's name is Zelda, and I will make sure you can earn up to 1 extra credit point if you miss a question on this first quiz. Again, the cat's name is Zelda. All right, so let's talk about experimental research, right? So experimental research, we're now moving on from observational research or descriptive research, is going to really be focused on the true blue kind of experimental scientific method, where we are going to predict and explain behaviors and mental processes. And how we do that is we can manipulate our independent variables and measure its effects on our dependent variables. Where in observational studies, we can't actually manipulate these variables. We just have to watch and see what happens. So we know that the independent variable is the variable that the researcher controls, and our dependent variable is the variable that the other researcher, that researcher observes and measures for an effect. So our independent variable is our causal variable, and our dependent variable is the effect of that cause. So the response to our variable, our dependent variable, is reliant on whatever our independent variable is, or maybe a treatment or something of that sort. You might also hear that called. So the goal of this is to predict and explain behaviors and mental processes. So how do we do that? Well, we compare our results of our experimental and control groups. So we might get an experimental group who gets our manipulation and treatment, and we might have a control group that gets no treatment or a placebo. So in my example with hammers and feathers, I don't have a control group, but it's more likely than not that the feather example is more like a placebo or more like a control group. You don't have to have a control group. Sometimes you can just compare two groups. So maybe I take half of the class and teach a topic a certain way on one day a week, and then for my other students in the other day of the week class, I teach it a different way. And I might see how they score on that quiz. And that is going to be the idea of, just two experimental groups pushing against each other, or, competing for which one does better without a control group. But with experimental research, the strengths of this is that it really helps us determine cause and effect, which we can't do in descriptive research. And we have these independent and dependent variables that help us to understand and understand the cause and effect of this. So some limits, though, why we don't only use experimental research is we might have things like confounds. And confounds are these factors that might have affected our dependent variable along with or instead of our independent variable. So some types of confounds might be random variables or experimenter and subject biases or sampling issues, What if my study is looking at how many people come to an event based on different types of social media presence. So maybe in one version of this, I ask people to come to a psychology open house event, and I do only Facebook social media posts about it. And another one, I just send out a email about it and say it's all going to be on campus on these certain Fridays. And so I'm comparing these two groups. Well, what happens if it's raining during one of those days? Or what happens if there's a hurricane or something? We might not get the same results because there might be other factors that are affecting this. Now, it's pretty obvious with things like that, but what about exams and taking them at different times of the day? If you're anything like me, you might get the 2 p.m. blahs and get kind of tired in the afternoon, and that might affect how people do. And on a wide scale, that might actually affect how well people perform. There's also things like experimenter and subject biases that we kind of talked about. And then there's some what we can also call extraneous variables. So, for instance, one of the things that might happen here is that we might, again, pool a group of people who aren't completely random. We might pool only Stetson students, or we might pool only an elderly population or a young population. And depending on the questions we ask, that might have very different outcomes. So how we can work on that is that we can use different experimental designs. And so what we do is we randomly select people for a sample. And we do this from a population. And now a population doesn't necessarily mean the whole world. So that is one population, but we can also think about a population being the population of Stetson students. All students who are currently enrolled at Stetson make up that population. But from those populations, whether it be the whole wide world, whether it be just the people in Stetson, whether it be just my students in my intro class, I can randomly assign people to a condition. So what I do there is I take from this population, this big group of people, and I take a smaller subset of them from a sample. And I might randomly assign them to a condition from that sample, whether that be the experimental group or the control group. So when I went through to figure out who was going to be in which class which day, I didn't want to cut it directly in half. And what I did was I randomly, I put you guys through a number generator, and I said give it either a 1 or a 2. And then I flipped a coin and I said, which day is going to be Tuesday? Is Tuesday going to be heads, which is 1, or tails, which is 2? And that is about as random as I can choose you guys to be in, right, a different class or different section, not sections, you know what I mean, come at different days for this class. So these are ways that we can help us understand if we're doing good science, right? Now, this is kind of similar to things that you see in other sciences, right? If I was going to take a sample of water to see how potable or drinkable it was, I might choose some different places along a river, right? I'm probably not going to just choose a specific one. I'm going to take it from several places. Now, I can't take the population, right, every single drop of water in that whole river, but I can just scoop out a sample, right? And that might help me to, right, see differences as well. So experimental design regarding populations and samples is something that can be a little confusing. And if you have questions, we can talk about it. But remember that what we're trying to do here is make it so that everybody who could possibly get this question or take part in our survey might be randomly selected to do so. And that's not always possible, as we know. So one of the last things we're going to talk about, though, is reliability and validity. And so reliability and validity are very, very important. One time during graduate school, my mom called me out of nowhere and she said, "Hey, how do you know if you're measuring what you want to measure?" And I went, "That's a really good question, Mom. You should take my Intro to Psych class, and I talk a lot about that." And that's a really, really good question. If I ask you, how happy are you? How do I know if I'm measuring what I want to? And not only that, those questions might change, right? Are we accurately measuring what we think we're measuring? So we know now that BMI, or body mass index, is not a great way to tell how healthy you are, because you can be what they call overweight, but be incredibly muscular, right? Because you're measuring your height and your weight, and those aren't always going to be perfect. And so we can talk about reliability and validity as two different things. And so with reliability, what we're talking about here is how consistent is our measure, right? Are we measuring what we want to measure? So, right, this is going to be a very reliable scale here if, right, every time you step on and off that scale, you're going to get 150 pounds, which I would love to say was my weight, but it is not. But if you get a scale that isn't reliable, this scale might differ in what it says every time you step on it. That's not a good scale. And I don't mean to just use scale in the same way that we use scales for psychology, but, right, that's something that you'd throw that out and you'd say, well, this isn't useful. This isn't reliable. We can't be sure if it's accurate. So reliability is this tendency for a measure to produce the same result whenever it is used to measure the same thing. If I take a tape measure and measure your height, hopefully that's going to be a reliable measure, that if I come in tomorrow and measure your height, it should be pretty darn accurate. So how consistently a test will measure the variable of interest is an important thing to understand, right? Because I want to give, right, an exam, for instance, that reliably tells me that you are learning from the class. So I don't want to give an exam, right, that asks you questions that that maybe aren't accurate. But with validity, on the other hand, this is the idea of it, can we trust the findings? Are these findings valid? And so when we talk about measurement validity, we're talking about the degree to which a test accurately measures a variable of interest. So one thing we can talk about is, are IQ tests true measures of intelligence? We'll talk about that later when we talk about intelligence, but the idea is it's not exactly the only way to measure something. Maybe we're measuring it in a different way that doesn't work. So are we actually measuring the variable that we're trying to measure? So again, if I am trying to, say, measure how well you're doing in this class, and I ask you, and I ask you, to do calculus on the exam, that's not a valid measure because that's not actually looking at what we think we should be looking at. With validity, too, we can also talk about internal versus external validity. And what we mean by that is that with internal validity, the extent to which only our independent variable influences the dependent variable. So for instance, if I run a study where I have young kids watch a violent TV show versus a cartoon, and I measure how happy they are, how aggressive they are afterwards, that might be very valid. It might be. But what if I only have boys watch the violent TV and then I only have girls watch the cartoon? Well, it's probably just not the independent variable at that point. It's probably something regarding gender as well. We could easily say, well, it was only boys that watched the one and girls that watched the other. How do you know it's not gender that matters? So that is going to be the idea of internal validity. And external validity is the extent to which the findings generalize to the real world. So a great example of external validity is, if I ask you, have you ever lied? Most people will say, no, I've never lied, or, they might say, I've only lied a little bit. And which case, that's probably not true, and it's probably not generalizable to the real world, because otherwise you would say, no, nobody lies ever, right? All my research says that nobody lies. And so those are going to be kind of what we are talking about with validity. So the last thing with reliability and validity, and the last thing we'll talk about is this chart, which I think is a great way to understand reliability versus validity. So our first measure over here is very, very reliable, right? Because it is accurately hitting in the same place. It's very reliable. When we shoot, we are finding the same answers, or we're hitting the same spot. However, it's not really valid because it's not hitting what we want it to. It's not right. It's not accurate. It's not doing what we want it to. Here, in the second one, we have it's valid, right? Because we did hit the center at least once, but it's not reliable because we only hit it once. If I asked you to look at a broken clock and tell me what time it is, you're going to be right twice a day, right? That clock is going to be right 2 times a day, as long as the clock isn't moving slower or faster or whatever it might be. But that doesn't mean it's reliable, right? Because it's not the same answer. We would say that this is not reliable or valid because it's not hitting all the possibilities, and it's very spread out. And lastly, we have reliable and valid, where we are hitting our mark consistently. And what we want in psychology is to find measures that are both reliable and valid. So that is all I have for today, for this week. So make sure you complete that class quiz before our next synchronous class session. And my office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30, also by appointment. If you have any questions, you can also email me at any time. Looking forward to talking about our next lecture next week. And if you need anything, please email me, and have a good one.